Hello, and welcome back to the Outgrowth Deep Dive series. We're taking a look at my new plugin, Outgrowth, that I built with my friend BlankFor.ms. And today we're going to talk about the modulation matrix. If you're unfamiliar with what the concept of modulation is in an instrument like this, it's basically where you have the ability to modulate the sound of the instrument based on some generative techniques or maybe performance techniques. So the modulation hub in Outgrowth is kind of going to be a one-stop shop for either increasing the performability of the instrument or just adding to some unpredictability or adding just a little bit of motion. It's kind of like almost like having a bunch of other hands kind of tweaking knobs as you're just focusing on playing or focusing on one particular thing. So today we're going to walk through pretty much every one of the options in the modulation matrix, and we're going to just look at one or two ways that modulation option really shines. I'm going to do this pretty much entirely off the cuff, so I might ramble at some points, but I also think that it's really important to show kind of my natural, use of this instrument. I think that it's something that's really fun to sit with for a while, and I want to show that a bit. So, if you don't already know, if you want to access the modulation matrix in Outgrowth, there's this menu button up top, and then we open this side panel where we've got all of our modulation options. You can make up to 16 assignments, which is hopefully way more than you'll ever need, but you can kind of go as deep as you want to go with it. So the first one is an LFO. If you don't know what an LFO is, it's basically a low frequency oscillator. It's designed to create motion that repeats, but at slower than audible rates. So it's just something that can kind of give this push and this pull, kind of like a breath to your sound, right? And you can see it right here. This value goes to the top of this crest and then comes back down. Our LFO has two main controls. It's got a speed. We can speed it up. We can slow it down. You can sync that to your BPM. So if you want to have a synced speed. And there's a morph option. And that morph option is basically going to control just whether or not the LFO kind of hangs around its maximum value or its minimum value for longer. So let's say, you want this kind of push and pull, but maybe you want it to kind of almost like the ocean, we're receding and then we quickly have a wave and then we're receding. We spend most of our time, kind of back off of the shore, and then maybe 10% of the time we want to have some kind of, wave motion that comes into the shore. So this is a really nice way just to kind of configure, if you want that motion to kind of peak a little bit more as opposed to just being completely linear. So when I think of the LFO, I think of synthesizers in particular. So I'm going to flip over to one of Outgrowth's synth modes. So this is the delve mode, which is basically a wavetable synthesizer. It turns our sample into a wavetable. And let's just hear how it sounds at an arbitrary point. So it sounds okay, but if you know wavetable synthesizers, they love motion. So let's add a little motion to it. So I'm going to take our LFO, I slowed it down a little bit, and I'm just going to drag the LFO to the start point. And I'm going to turn up that modulation. Let's get some pretty broad sweeps. So already way more motion, something way more interesting, in my opinion. And you can throw a little bit of the sub oscillator underneath that to kind of make everything a little bit more homogeneous and consistent. So that's a nice way that we can just add a little bit of quick motion. The LFO is kind of usually my go-to for just adding a little bit of motion. And by the way, the LFO time can be modulated as well. So if we want to make that just a little bit less predictable, we can take something else and have that modulate the LFO time. And now we've kind of got this compounding, multi-dimensional modulation going on. So that's always fun. And that brings me to the next modulation source, which is called Jitter. Jitter is basically, it's a smooth random. You can kind of see it on this visual. It's basically just a Brownian motion-based randomizer, which is just going to kind of wander around. It's not going to jump around totally randomly from one value to the next, but it's going to randomly go up or down and just kind of meander. So we can control the speed of this. We can get pretty glacial, or we can kind of turn it into a frenzy. So I think that the jitter is really nice for some of our audio effects in particular. I'm going to flip over to Radiate. Let's hear how this sounds without anything. We have some feedback on there. I'm going to remove that. All right, let's hear that again. So a pretty basic kind of additive synth tone. Now, what I'm going to do is, let's add a little bit of resonance back in. And I'm going to assign the jitter to the filter. And now it's just going to kind of move our filter around, which is really nice as we hold out a note. So that's kind of cool. We could try it on maybe ripple to get kind of like a variable amount of tape effect. I should also point out that one thing I really like doing when I'm assigning modulation is switching this over to the bipolar mode, which means that we're going to add and subtract from the value. But this is really cool because if you actually just go down to 0% or 100% and you're in bipolar mode, you kind of spend half the time below 0%. So you kind of get a nice like pocket of normalcy. Let's kind of hear how that sounds. So I think jitter is really nice, just basically on any of the audio effects in particular. It's also fun on the subvert or volume, just to kind of like, you know, add a little bit of volume variation. In particular, a lot of like tape machines have a little bit of variation to their volume. They don't really play a precise volume the whole time. So jitter can help you approximate that, which is fun. All right, on to the next one. Next, we have velocity. Velocity is basically how soft or how hard you press a key on your keyboard. This is kind of a very classic performance-based modulation source. It's, something that you have in a real piano or guitar. The harder you press a note or play a note, there's going to be a different timbre to it. So velocity is kind of a classic thing here. By default, this is actually mapped to your volume. So notes that are played harder are going to be louder, which is, much like a real acoustic instrument. But I think it's also fun to play around with velocity on other aspects as well. For example, one of the things I like doing is not changing the volume of notes, but maybe changing their timbre and making them brighter. So I am going to assign velocity to the cross mod here in Radiate. Let's just hear how the cross mod sounds first. So the cross mod basically, it's like this giant ring modulator where all of our sine waves are modulating each other. So I think that's pretty cool to assign to the velocity of a note. And we can start playing with some notes being brighter than others. A little bit of clipping there at the end. Whoops. But believe it or not, those notes were all the same volume. And all that was changing is just how bright they were. So, yeah. So I think that's a really fun thing that you could play with the performance. You could do, you could do something like ripple. That could be fun with more velocity. Just be aware that ripple is a global effect, so it's going to kind of snap to the most recent note. And ripple also behaves in a kind of like tape delay style way where it kind of like whips to a new value, which is fun. But yeah, so that's velocity. I'm going to flip over to a different engine because I'm sick of this one. By the way, this is what our original sample sounds like. Really nice. So that brings us to our next modulation source, which is random per note. What this is kind of what it sounds like. It's basically a dice roll every time a note starts. It's a random value every time. Every note's going to get a different value. And that's nice because it lets us change certain things. But that value is going to stay fixed throughout the lifetime of the note. So something like jitter is a random source, but it's running constantly. So if you want just kind of like a one-time random per note is a really nice option. So random per note is pretty fun. For example, in this mode, the stem mode, on the start time, we are going to start playing at a random point in the sample. And because we're doing that, let me turn up the subvert to kind of make it a little bit more consistent across wherever we start playing. Let's hear what happens. And that's also cool. We could do something like this. We could turn up the random to kind of span the full breadth of this. And then if we stick our end point in the middle, if we end up with a start point after the end point, we're actually going to reverse. So let's see how that sounds. Of course, sometimes you might get a really short note. but I think that's a pretty cool effect either way. Also, you should know that this random value, if you were to assign random per note to multiple destinations, you get an independent random value for each destination. So just to show that, I will drag it to the start point, and then I'll drag it to subvert. And you should be able to see them moving independently of one another. You know, you might have a high, well, you see it right now. You might have a high start value and a lower subvert value because each of those random values is going to be completely divorced from one another. So this is just a great way to add a little bit of variation to a sound, especially things like start points or windows or things like that, and the engines themselves, I think, really respond well to random per note. Okay, so next we have the ADSR envelope. This is basically the primary ADSR, which is exposed as a modulation source. And that's really nice just for essentially tying anything to the volume. It's kind of an interesting one because I don't reach for it a lot for reasons that I'll explain in a second, but it's really nice to have. So, for example, let us have the ADSR modulate the filter feedback. So we're basically going to have feedback swell with the volume of the note. I should probably turn down the volume overall. If we have a slower attack, we'll really hear those. So that's really cool. I like kind of having motion like that, you know, where we're kind of distorting the signal. Having that tied to the volume is a very kind of natural sound, I think. It's almost like hard to hear because I think it, at least to me, it sounds natural. Like, of course, while this sound is swelling, of course it starts breaking up. You know, that's a sound that we hear all the time. But anyway, the reason that I don't often use that envelope is because there's a second one here in the modulation matrix. And the second ADSR is really nice just for kind of dialing in, you know, some motion across the lifetime of the note, but giving it its own kind of feel. And in particular, one thing that I really like with the second ADSR is a lot of times I don't want sustain on this value. For example, here it's kind of set up to like pluck. I think that is often the sound that I'm after. So I might want, you know, the primary ADSR to have some sustain, but I often don't want this one to have some sustain. So an example of this would be the playback pitch. I want to modulate the pitch of the sample, but I want it to return down to the original pitch. So if I were to just assign this primary ADSR to the pitch of the sample or the pitch of the playback, you're actually not going to return to the bass pitch because your sustain level is high. But if we use a second ADSR, we can set that sustain level to 0, and then we're just gonna we're gonna slide into that note. I could listen to that all day, so I'll save you from that. Yeah, so moving along, we have the mod wheel. You probably know what the mod wheel does. I think it's really nice just for kind of any hands-on manipulation. One thing that's kind of fun is that if we have multiple samples loaded, let me Let me find another one. Is that the one we already have? No, it's not. Okay. So I'm going to load 2 samples, and I'm going to put us in scanning mode. Now you see we get this big scan in the middle of the UI. We can kind of scan between these 2 samples. And so the mod wheel is really nice for that. So I'm going to assign the mod wheel to sample scanning. And then we can just kind of Okay, so the next couple you're probably going to be a little familiar with. We're going to take a look at polyphonic aftertouch. So aftertouch is kind of on a lot of MIDI keyboards these days. Once you've played a note, you can kind of depress the key further and just kind of get this really nice performance aspect where you can kind of press each note just a little bit harder and kind of change the timbre of it over time. So one thing that I like using the aftertouch with is to kind of explore different parts of the samples. So I'm going to turn up the subvert, and let me just play this sample really quick so you know what I'm talking about. So this is a sample that's by BlankFor.ms. So it was recorded to tape, and it has a ton of tape noise depending where you're playing in this sample. You can see there's a big tail here, but that's actually a noise floor that we can bring up with subvert. If you want to learn more about the subvert control, I have a separate video on that. But let's hear this sample really quick. So towards the end of it is kind of all noise. And what I want to do is I want to kind of control whether or not we're hearing tone or noise. So I'm going to create this window in retain, which is going to play, it's going to just sustain the sample with granular synthesis. So I can just hold that like that, and we're hearing the tone. But we can move this. Oops. If we move the start point with it, we're hearing more noise towards the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use Aftertouch to move this window. And then as I kind of depress each of the keys, we're going to explore different parts of this window, or different parts of the sample. And as it says here, this is polyphonic, so you can do this kind of for each key, which is really cool. So we can kind of have each finger performing a different modulation, which is really awesome. And then similar to that is actually in MPE mode. I'm going to do a whole separate video on MPE. But in MPE mode, we have a very similar control called pressure. And that's kind of similar to Aftertouch, except that it's kind of throughout the entire lifetime of the note. So with most keyboards, you have to kind of press and you get to a point and then you kind of have Aftertouch, but pressure kind of knows where you are throughout the entirety of the note. So that can be really cool. I like to use that on something like the attack time. So, for example, well, let me start from the beginning. You might think that this would be really cool on the volume, and it is. Let me show you that. Are we Not getting pressure. Oh. So you might think the pressure is really cool on the volume, and it is. Let me show that. We can kind of manipulate the volume of the note with the pressure. We can even do that from 0. But what I don't really like about that is you have to be really intentional about letting go of the note, because if you let it go too quickly, it just kind of snaps to 0 like that. So what I like doing instead is actually using pressure to manipulate the ADSR. So for example, we could use pressure to change the sustain level. Let's hear that. And now we still have the release stage of the note, so wherever you kind of release it, you still get a nice natural taper no matter what. I also really like the pressure when applied to the attack as well. So I like to kind of set a baseline high attack, and then I use the pressure to reduce the attack. So these also go negative. So I'm going to set it such that when I play with more pressure, the attack time reduces. So if I play really softly, we get that slow attack, but if I strike the note, we actually get that short percussive attack. So that's really nice. You can kind of mix and match which notes have a bit of onset to them and which notes just kind of strike right into them. Like I said, I'm going to do a full video on MPE, and I think there's a lot of cool applications of pressure that I want to showcase. Okay, and finally, I'm going to talk about key tracking. I'm going to skip MIDI CCs because that's kind of usually specific to your own setup. I think if you use MIDI CCs, you know what you want to do with them. But I'm going to take a look at the key track really quick. So key track is basically a modulation source that's tied to the pitch of the note. It's going to be lower when you play a low note, and it's going to be higher when you play a high note. So this has a lot of really interesting capabilities, I think. The first thing that comes to mind for me is that a lot of times if you have a synth sound, let's say I want a synth sound with a lot of resonance. Let's get a little envelope. Let's get more resonance than that even. So if you have a sound like this with a lot of resonance, it sounds great on lower notes, I think. If you play higher notes, it kind of starts to sound not great, in my opinion. So key tracking is really nice because we can just take that right there, and let's reduce the resonance based on how high a note is. So we're going to see it move as we play keys. It's still kind of screaming anyway, but you can hear the difference. So I think that's a really nice sound. It's kind of a way to create something that sounds a little bit more natural, in my opinion. And another thing that I really like using key tracking on is, again, I like manipulating the ADSR with it. I like creating these patches where maybe our lower notes are plucky, but our higher notes are kind of apologetic and fade in. So you can kind of create these really interesting keys lines. And you can really dial that in with the attack time as well. And just one other idea. I think it's kind of fun to use it on the smear because, you know, for example, you might not want a lot of reverb on your lower notes. So maybe you want smear to get turned up only as you play a higher note. And again, just know that because smear is a global control, you're just going to kind of snap to that new value. But the other stuff I showed, like the ADSR and the filter, that's all per note. So you're going to get something that is kind of completely unique for each voice that you play. Yeah, so that is Outgrowth's modulation matrix. Hopefully you stuck around because I think this ended up being pretty long. But I think there's a lot of capability here, and this is one of the parts of Outgrowth that gets me the most excited. I think, you know, it's a sample player, it can be a synthesizer, and it's really powerful once you start throwing this modulation at things. And I think it's just really nice, and I find it to be logical. You know, if I have a goal with a patch, like, oh, this is nice, but I want those high notes to be a little bit less screechy. You know, it's really easy just to hop in here and grab something and kind of adjust that to, you know, whatever you think would sound better. So definitely hope you have fun with the modulation matrix. We had a lot of fun building it and thinking of all the things that could be included in it. And I hope that you enjoy Outgrowth and all of the modulation capabilities. Take care.